Would you believe me if I told you that beneath Rome's glittering temples and triumphant legions, there existed a world so dark that even history itself tried to bury it? A world where young men were stripped of choice, forced into roles meant to entertain and degrade, their bodies mutilated, their dignity erased, all to feed the pleasure and power of Rome's elite. This wasn't just exploitation. It was a system designed to turn human beings into living symbols of domination. Tonight, we uncover the hidden truth of Rome's male concubines, the exploitation, the brutality, and the torment that the history books rarely dare to tell. Before we dive in, just a quick ask. These videos take a lot of time, research, and care to create. If you're enjoying the journey through these forgotten corners of history, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything, but it means everything to the channel and helps keep these stories alive. Thank you so much. Sexual exploitation and status. To understand the lives of male concubines in Rome, we need to peel back the polished marble facade of the empire and look at what lay in its shadows. Rome projected itself as the beacon of civilization. Grand architecture, mighty armies, brilliant thinkers. But behind the triumphs and glory was a system built on slavery, and at the bottom of that system were those whose very existence was twisted into tools of power. Among them were young men forced into the degrading role of concubinage. Rome thrived on conquest. Every new territory meant not just land and riches, but people. Thousands of captives dragged back in chains. Gaul, Greece, the Middle East, North Africa. No corner of the Mediterranean world was untouched by Roman expansion. Captured men were sorted like cattle. Some were sent to the mines, doomed to exhaustion and early death. Others were trained for the arena, to fight wild beasts for the amusement of crowds. But some were set aside for something more private and, in many ways, far darker. They were chosen not for strength or skill, but for appearance. Youthful features, smooth skin, and submissive potential. These became the concubines of Rome's elite, and here's where Roman culture adds a disturbing twist. Unlike modern ideas of morality, the Romans did not see same-sex relations as inherently shameful. What mattered to them was who held the dominant role. A freeborn Roman male could indulge in relationships with enslaved men or women without any loss of status, so long as he was the penetrator. To be on the receiving end was considered degrading, dishonorable, and unworthy of a citizen. That stigma wasn't attached to the master. It was forced entirely onto the enslaved concubine. Imagine the humiliation. Their suffering wasn't just physical, but cultural. They were branded as weak, tainted, and less than men. In Roman eyes, they were living emblems of subjugation, not just enslaved bodies, but symbols of conquered peoples. Every encounter reinforced the same cruel message. You are beneath me. You exist only to prove my dominance. This reality blurred the lines between exploitation and politics. For Rome's upper class, keeping concubines wasn't merely about pleasure. It was about broadcasting power. To parade a household filled with enslaved concubines was a status symbol, proof that a man's wealth and authority reached into the most intimate corners of life. Some aristocrats were even mocked for boasting of how many they owned, turning human suffering into a twisted form of social currency. What made it even more horrifying was how normalized it became. Philosophers, poets, and satirists of the time make casual references to young male concubines as though they were simply part of the household, no different from a cook or a servant. Their pain and humiliation were erased in the culture that surrounded them, reduced to a punchline or a casual detail in elite gossip. To exist as a concubine was to live without dignity, without recognition, and without escape. And yet, even within that world, the hypocrisy was glaring. Roman men prided themselves on their discipline, their masculinity, their self-control. But the truth was that the line between discipline and indulgence blurred easily behind closed doors. The concubine, powerless to resist, became the outlet for the elite's unchecked desires. The contradiction was almost laughable. In public, these masters preached Roman virtue. In private, they violated it nightly. Perhaps one of the darkest aspects of this system was how it robbed concubines of identity. They were often renamed, stripped of their cultural heritage, and turned into anonymous possessions. Their personal stories, their families, their past lives, all erased, replaced with a role they never chose. In the grand halls of Rome, they became silent props in the theater of power. Think about what that must have meant emotionally. To live in constant fear, to be reduced to an object, to have your entire worth defined not by who you were, but by what was done to you. For many concubines, life was not about living at all. It was about enduring, surviving from one day to the next. The psychological scars must have been as deep as the physical ones, though the Roman record rarely bothers to acknowledge them. And here lies the cruel irony. In Rome, the shame was never on the abuser. The elite man who forced himself on his concubines was admired for his virility and power. The enslaved, meanwhile, bore the entire weight of dishonor, as though the humiliation was somehow their fault. It was a system designed to protect the powerful and silence the powerless. And in that silence, countless lives were crushed and forgotten. So when we talk about Roman concubinage, we're not just talking about hidden relationships in the shadows of marble villas. We're talking about a society where suffering was turned into status, where humiliation was institutionalized, and where the most intimate violations became symbols of dominance. For the concubine, every moment was a reminder that in Rome, your body was not your own. It was the property of an empire that saw you as nothing more than proof of another man's power. Castration. As dark as exploitation was, some enslaved men in Rome faced an even crueler fate: castration. If concubinage stripped them of freedom, castration went further, robbing them of both future and identity. Now here's an important detail. Roman citizens were legally protected from this practice. Castration was considered too extreme, even barbaric, for those born within the empire's privileged ranks. But laws meant little when it came to enslaved men imported from abroad. Captives from the East, from regions where eunuchs had long been part of royal courts as servants, musicians, or guardians, became targets. Rome saw the practice, copied it, and twisted it into its own brutal system of control. Young males were sometimes chosen for this fate because of their appearance. Roman elites had a disturbing fascination with eternal youthfulness, an aesthetic that blurred the lines between man and boy. A castrated concubine could not grow fully into adult manhood. Instead, his body was locked into an unnatural state of arrested development. To the Roman master, this wasn't seen as cruelty. It was seen as desirable, a way to mold another human being into a living ornament, a perpetual symbol of beauty and submission. But there was another reason, one just as calculating. Castration was also a way to prevent enslaved men from fathering children. Children born to enslaved women often became property of the master, adding to his wealth. But with male concubines, offspring could complicate things. Inheritance, bloodlines, even rumors of illegitimate children, all posed risks in a society obsessed with status and reputation. By cutting away the possibility of fatherhood, Rome ensured that enslaved concubines would never interfere with dynasties or cause political scandals. Their bodies were reshaped not just for pleasure, but for control. The procedure itself was horrific. Ancient medical accounts, though scarce, suggest it was usually carried out by crude means. In many cases, sharp knives or heated metal were used. There was no real anesthesia, no safe environment, no sterile instruments. The risk of infection was enormous, and many did not survive the operation. Those who did were often left permanently scarred, in pain, or suffering complications that lasted a lifetime. The physical trauma was brutal enough, but the psychological scars were just as deep. Imagine the terror leading up to it, to be told, or perhaps not even told, that you were about to lose not just your freedom, but a fundamental part of your identity. Imagine the helplessness, knowing that resistance meant death, but compliance meant a lifetime marked by humiliation. For the enslaved concubine, there was no choice, no dignity, no escape. In Rome's rigid hierarchy, none of this mattered. Eunuchs were seen as less than men, creatures outside the normal social order. They were used in whatever way suited their masters, as concubines, entertainers, servants, or even guards for the private quarters of elite households. The irony was chilling. Castrated men, denied the possibility of family or legacy, were often forced to protect the families of those who mutilated them. And yet, despite their suffering, eunuchs fascinated Roman society. Their voices, never deepening in the way of other men, were prized in music and performance. Their bodies, trapped in unnatural youth, became symbols of decadence. Some elites flaunted them as exotic possessions, as though displaying a eunuch was a mark of sophistication. What was, in truth, unimaginable cruelty was repackaged as luxury. But beneath that glittering facade lay the reality. A castrated concubine was not seen as fully human. He was an object, frozen in a state of dependence, valued only for how he served another's pleasure or convenience. His body was property, altered and controlled to suit the whims of his owner. And the cruelty didn't end there. Castration also carried immense social stigma. In Roman culture, masculinity was defined by dominance, by virility, by the ability to father children and lead a household. A eunuch was stripped of all of that. He was considered weak, incomplete, unworthy of respect. Even among other enslaved people, eunuchs were often treated with contempt, as though their suffering made them somehow less than. This meant that castrated concubines were trapped in a double prison, despised by the society that mutilated them, and dependent on the very masters who had destroyed their futures. They lived on the margins, their identities erased, their dignity denied. To survive meant to accept invisibility, to endure humiliation, and to carry scars that never truly healed. When we talk about castration in Rome, we're not just talking about a medical procedure. We're talking about a system that deliberately reshaped human beings into symbols of power. Every cut, every scar, was a reminder that Rome's dominance extended beyond the battlefield, beyond politics, even beyond life itself. It reached into the most intimate parts of the body, twisting nature itself to serve the desires of the powerful. And that is perhaps the darkest truth of all. Castration was not only about control, it was about erasure, erasing manhood, erasing identity, erasing the possibility of legacy. For Rome, it was the ultimate display of dominance, to take a living person and strip him not just of freedom, but of the very things that made him whole. Physical and emotional abuse. If exploitation and castration weren't horrifying enough, the daily lives of male concubines in Rome were marked by abuse, both physical and emotional. Their existence was not simply about servitude. It was about being stripped of every possible right, treated as living possessions in a society that valued power over humanity. Legally, concubines were property. That meant their masters had absolute control. They could humiliate them, beat them, or discard them entirely without facing consequences. Violence wasn't an exception. It was the rule, a constant reminder of who held power. A concubine who resisted could be whipped, starved, or publicly degraded, and no law would intervene. For Roman masters, cruelty was not only a punishment, but also a performance, a way to display dominance in front of others. And the cruelty went far beyond physical pain. Concubines were often subjected to deliberate humiliation. Some were dressed in degrading ways, paraded before guests, or mocked in public. Roman society was obsessed with status, and one way to elevate the master's prestige was to reduce another human being to a symbol of weakness. A concubine's suffering became a spectacle, reinforcing the message that Rome's elite could bend anyone, body and soul, to their will. But perhaps the deepest wounds weren't physical at all. They were emotional. Imagine being captured in war, torn from your homeland, your family, your language, your gods. Imagine being thrust into a world where you were not a person but an object, valued only for how you could entertain or satisfy someone else. For these young men, survival meant silence. Every word, every gesture had to be calculated, because displeasing a master could mean punishment, exile, or even death. The emotional toll was immense. Concubines lived under constant surveillance, watched and controlled at every turn. There was no privacy, no safe space to retreat to, no real identity outside of servitude. Even their names were sometimes erased or changed to suit the household, another layer of control that chipped away at their individuality. Over time, many concubines became shadows of themselves, reduced to roles they never chose but could never escape. And there was another layer of torment, the stigma of dishonor. In Roman culture, masculinity was tied to dominance, authority, and control. To be forced into the role of concubine was to be branded as subordinate, stripped of dignity in the eyes of society. Even if they endured silently, even if they survived, Roman culture marked them as weak, unmanly, and inferior. This stigma outlasted any physical wound. It meant that even within the enslaved population, concubines could be seen as outcasts, bearing a shame that wasn't theirs to carry, but was forced upon them nonetheless. The masters understood this dynamic, and they weaponized it. The very existence of concubines was a reminder to others of what could happen if they lost power, if they became vulnerable. Their humiliation served as a living warning to rivals and subordinates alike. Resist, and you too could be reduced to this. In this way, the abuse of concubines was not just personal cruelty, but a political tool, reinforcing Rome's obsession with hierarchy and control. And yet, for all of this, the voices of concubines are almost entirely absent from history. Unlike emperors, generals, or senators, they did not write their own chronicles. Their experiences weren't etched in stone or celebrated in triumphs. Instead, their lives survive only in fragments. Scandalous rumors, hostile accounts, and rare mentions in Roman writings. And even those glimpses are clouded by bias, written not to tell their story, but to serve someone else's agenda. Still, in those fragments, enough truth seeps through to reveal the bleak reality. What emerges is not a story of luxury or romance, as some might imagine when hearing the word concubine. It is a story of relentless subjugation, of violence woven into daily life, of dignity erased and humanity denied. Consider the emotional resilience it must have taken to survive. To wake each day knowing your life was not your own, your body not your own, your future not your own, and yet to keep living. Some concubines endured for years in this shadowed existence, their lives a testament not to freedom or choice, but to endurance under circumstances almost unimaginable today. The silence of these men is itself telling. Their absence in history is not accidental. It is the result of a system designed to erase them, to use them until they were no longer useful, and then to let them disappear without record. Their suffering was not preserved in monuments or celebrated in epic poetry. It was hidden in the cracks, whispered as scandal, remembered only when it served to shame someone else. And that is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. For every name we know, for every rumor recorded, there were countless others whose stories will never be told. They lived, they suffered, and they died, often forgotten even in their own time. Their pain was real, but history reduced it to footnotes and fragments. In the end, the life of a male concubine in Rome was defined by relentless abuse, physical beatings, emotional torment, social stigma, and the complete erasure of self. They were reminders of the darkest side of Roman power, the side that thrived not only on conquest and politics, but on the destruction of human dignity. And though history may have tried to silence them, the fragments that remain are enough to force us to remember. Behind the grandeur of Rome stood countless invisible lives, crushed under its weight. Short lives. If all of this wasn't already devastating enough, there's one more truth about the lives of male concubines in Rome that history makes painfully clear. Their lives were often short. Concubines were not expected to grow old. In fact, the system itself was designed to use them while they were considered desirable, and then discard them once their youth faded. For many, that meant their lives ended far earlier than they should have, cut short by abuse, neglect, or deliberate abandonment. The dangers began with the very practices forced upon them. Castration alone carried a staggering risk of death. The procedure was often carried out in secret, without proper medical care, and infections were common. Ancient accounts suggest that many did not survive the operation itself. Those who did were left with weakened bodies, chronic pain, or lasting health complications that made survival into adulthood uncertain. In Rome's hierarchy, their suffering was not viewed as a tragedy. It was simply collateral damage in the pursuit of control and pleasure. For those who avoided castration, the daily abuse still chipped away at their health. Beatings, starvation, and constant humiliation weren't occasional punishments. They were part of life. A concubine who fell ill or showed signs of weakness was often left untreated, since their well-being mattered only as long as they could serve. Malnutrition, disease, and untreated injuries all contributed to the fact that many concubines never reached middle age. And then there was the psychological toll. Modern science tells us that constant stress, fear, and trauma can weaken the body, shorten life expectancy, and erode the will to live. Concubines endured all of this, trapped in a cycle of emotional torment that made survival feel less like living and more like existing in slow decline. They were cut off from family, from culture, from any sense of belonging. For many, hope itself was a luxury they could no longer afford. But perhaps the cruelest part of their short lives was what happened when their value in the eyes of their masters inevitably diminished. In Rome, youth was currency. The moment a concubine aged out of the beauty and vulnerability their masters desired, their role became precarious. Some were cast aside, sold into harsher forms of labor, or left to fend for themselves with no support. Others were simply discarded, abandoned to die in obscurity, once they no longer served a purpose. The system was never built for their survival, only for their exploitation. Their deaths were rarely recorded, their names rarely remembered. History celebrates Rome's emperors, its generals, and its monuments, but the countless concubines who perished remain invisible. Their lives were measured not by their humanity, but by the fleeting satisfaction they could provide. Once that faded, so too did their chance at life. And yet, even in the silence of history, we can piece together the truth. The fragments left behind, whispers in ancient texts, insults hurled at rivals, rumors of imperial decadence, all point to the same reality. Concubines were never meant to endure. They were used, reshaped, broken, and finally cast aside. In the most brutal sense, they were disposable. Think about what that means. Entire generations of young men, taken from conquered lands, lived and died in the shadows of Roman luxury. They built no legacies, raised no families, and left behind no monuments. Instead, their short lives served as silent sacrifices to a culture obsessed with power, dominance, and control. Their pain was the hidden cost of Rome's grandeur, their deaths the unspoken tragedy beneath its triumphs. And perhaps that's why their stories strike us so deeply today. Because behind the marble palaces and grand arenas, behind the rhetoric of Roman glory, lay a system that consumed lives without hesitation and then erased the evidence. The short lives of concubines remind us that Rome's greatness was not built only on engineering or conquest, but also on the quiet suffering of those who were never meant to survive long enough to be remembered. In the end, the tragedy of the concubines is not just that their lives were filled with exploitation, abuse, and torment. It's that for so many, those lives were brief. Stolen youth, wasted potential, silenced voices. They were human beings reduced to fleeting shadows, living just long enough to serve others, but not long enough to claim their own place in history. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. We know these are not easy stories to hear, and we deeply appreciate you joining us on this exploration of history's darker corners. If you found this video insightful, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with others who are interested in untold history, and subscribing to the channel to make sure you don't miss our next chapter. Thank you, and see you in the next episode of Dark Lore.